So those of you who don't know me, I've worked for 21 years at a site called the Children's Place. And the Children's Place is a site in Kansas City, Missouri on 59th and Brookside that works with children who are exhibiting developmental delays due to significant abuse and neglect. And one of the things that we've always dealt with there is selective mutism. And so we have this population of children that have been significantly traumatized and are coming in afraid to talk. And so selective mutism, I think, has kind of morphed its definition over time. And I look at those children as children who have been conditioned not to talk. So if you're in an abusive setting and you realize that when you talk, attention gets drawn to you, and therefore it's not a good thing, talking's not a good thing, I look at those children as they've been conditioned not to talk. Whereas with selective mutism, I tend to look at it as more of that anxiety issue of children who may have not come from a traumatized setting or background and for some unknown reason are selecting when they will talk and to who they will talk to. So I kind of do a differentiation diagnosis myself just because of my experience and background, and so then I treat those populations differently because I feel like I should. But, you know, again, I don't have a lot of research to support that, so I'm just kind of putting that out there, okay? So I did want to talk about selective mutism because you guys run into that, right? Okay. So I did this little great Prezi, which I thought was really cool. You know, the birds flying out of the box, like setting the voice free.
You need to go work for Prezi.
I know.
You really do.
They've been sending me emails saying, you know, you can organize your Prezis better by doing this. And I'm thinking, probably.
Oh my goodness.
I don't know that. So this is my video for this, which I just love to speak.
I don't get it, Shrek. Why'd you just pull some of that ogre stuff on him? You know, throttle him, lay siege to his fortress, grab his bones to make your bread. You know the whole ogre trick.
Oh, I know what. Maybe I could have decapitated an entire village and put their heads on a pike, got the knife, cut open their spleen and drink their fluids. Does that sound good to you?
No, not really, no.
Your information is a lot more to ogres than people think.
Example?
Example? Okay, ogres are like onions.
They stink?
Yes. No.
Or they make you cry?
No.
Oh, you leave them out in the sun, they get all brown, start sprouting little white hairs.
Layers. Onions have layers. Ogres have layers. Onions have layers. You get it. We both have layers.
Oh, you both have layers. Oh. You know, not everybody likes onions. Cake! Everybody loves cakes. Cakes have layers.
I don't care what everyone likes.
So when I've gone to try to explain selective mutism to parent groups or to other providers that don't necessarily have a social emotional background and don't understand anxiety, I do like to bring it up and start with this video because it is like having layers to it. So you have some child that has selective mutism and they'll speak at home and they'll speak with their family members and everything's great, but the minute they hit school, they won't talk at school at all. And so they have one little layer to what's going on. And then you have another one that, no, they'll talk at school if it's recess. Or they'll talk to a peer at school, but they won't talk to the teacher. So then that layer is kind of a little bit different, it goes a little bit deeper. So I feel like when you're dealing with these social and emotional issues that have this pretty defined outcome of not talking, which is going to show up, right, with academics, because you're not going to be successful. You have to look at how many layers are you dealing with this issue, okay? That makes sense? Sure, Kathy. When I talk to adults that have it, they do say feeling trapped. Selective mutism is a complex childhood anxiety disorder. It's characterized by a child's inability to speak and communicate effectively in select social settings, such as school. An individual's pattern of mutism can vary greatly, which is the layer thing that I like to talk about. Some children or adults never talk outside the home. Some whisper, and some speak with only a select few people. The individual has not elected to withhold the ability to talk in all situations. Rather, the individual selects the situation and people with whom they verbally communicate. Children with selective mutism typically do not speak at school, which interferes with academic, educational, and school performance. Children with disorder sometimes communicate via spoken or non-vocal means, pointing and writing. So what's the prevalence? The number of persons living with selective mutism at any given point in time. Let me see how I did this one. No, I didn't screw up, sorry. Sometimes I'm like, I build in different patterns. So it affects approximately 1% of children seen in behavioral health settings. 1% of children seen in behavioral health settings. So if they're in a behavioral health setting, they're there for an emotional, social emotional issue, and 1% of those seen there could have selective mutism, okay? It does appear somewhat to affect more females than males by a ratio of like 1.5 to 2.5. I have seen it more in females than I have in males. And then there's all the research. However, equal ratios have also shown up. Okay. The DSM-5 classifies it under anxiety disorders, which I'm giving you the American Psychiatric Association's 2013 page where you can look up the actual diagnostic criteria. But basically what they're wanting is to show consistent failure to speak in specific social situations in which an expectation for speaking exists, despite speaking in other situations. Disturbance interferes with achievement. Duration is at least a month. Failure to speak is not attributable to a lack of knowledge or comfort with spoken language. I never will forget. Got a little boy that had been pulled from his Spanish-speaking only home and placed within a foster home, and they were just sure he had selective mutism, when actually he was Spanish-speaking only and didn't know the English. So again, you got to be careful with some of that. And I've also had some of my significant stuttering individuals not speak because of the stuttering, and they thought that they had selective mutism when actually they just had fluency disorder. So keeping that in mind, and also keeping in mind that you're not dealing with autism spectrum children population, schizophrenia, or other psychotic disorders where you might actually have a disassociation going on. So they're not speaking because they're disassociating, which is not what selective mutism is. And these behaviors are felt to be a method of self-protection during an experience of intense anxiety, but may appear intentionally oppositional. And they don't want you to think it's oppositional, because when you get a true selective mutism, it's not oppositional. Social anxiety and social phobia. Individuals with selective mutism may also present with other social issues. Symptoms of social anxiety and social phobia may include lack of eye contact, clinging to parents, hiding, running away, crying, freezing, tantruming if asked to speak publicly, avoidance of eating in public, anxious when having pictures or video taken, and for some reason they added in this whole anxious to use public bathroom, which I thought was kind of interesting. I have a phobia for public bathrooms. My husband will go to any bathroom.
Well, they're scary. I have probably more parents with kids that are afraid because it's so loud in there. The toilet flush, that air fans.
Everything's automatic.
Yeah.
Waving and everything.
When I do the assessment, because we feel like that there is a selective mutism issue, I do the full 9 yards. And I try to establish a relationship, but I use speech and language testing, case history, speech sound production, voice and fluency, cognitive assessment. They'll do the whole 9 yards, direct observation. Many times I will ask a parent to video things because if they're not going to show me at the time, I want to make sure that I have the, I want to validate the parent's concern by having them show me what they're seeing. So doing that by having them video can help. And then collaborating with other team members, because you'll have a parent say, they're fine. I don't know why they're not talking at school. And school saying, they're not fine, they're not talking at school. So again, trying to understand that relationship, so making sure that I go to all those different environments when possible. My first meeting is usually very informal. Try to do it during play-based with no expectations of speech. So I avoid triggering the anxiety, which may impact my future progress. So if I'm trying to make a connection with this child and establish a relationship, I'm not going to require the child to do something that I know that they don't want to do the first time I meet them, right? So I'm going to avoid eye contact. I'm going to encourage a joint activity with gestures, like coloring, playing on the playground, and I'm going to be doing a lot of self-talk and reflect, and I'm going to stay calm, which sometimes is hard for me. On the outward, I look that way, right? There is a selective mutism questionnaire that you guys can get for free online that you can have the parent fill out and you can actually score it. So if you feel like you might be having some selective mutism issues, this is a resource for you to be able to pull up, and it's just selective mutism questionnaire. And it's like always, often, seldom, never is how it's rated. And there's actually a score for it. I've never used it, but you know, people create things and sell them and make really good money. When we look at treatment options, I'm old, and so I usually go with something that I've used in the past that has been working, but there have been new treatment programs that have been coming out for it. But early intervention really is the key. So if you get a child coming in on a diagnostic criteria that's the complaint, I would certainly want to put a team member in there to help that family work on that so it doesn't become a problem. And I would certainly also want you to partner with a mental health specialist who can help you see that mental health lens a little better if you don't already have a mental health lens. And then systematic desensitization is something that I use all the time. Stimulus fading, contingency management, positive reinforcement shaping. I don't like augmentative communication other than some signs and gestures, but I have had some people use a PECS, especially in a school setting when we need to get them to ask for certain things. You guys are dealing with that younger population, wouldn't necessarily be that big of a deal, but when I deal with my elementary school kids, it is a big deal when they're not able to ask for things. So sometimes I can get them to hold up a picture, and then that alerts the teacher that something needs to happen here, and they can at least advocate for themselves non-verbally. So I have used augmentative. I do have KU Lawrence ask me why I haven't used devices, and I say for obvious reasons, I use devices. But that's just my issue with augmentative communication being pushed to a level that I don't think is necessary. The SCAT, Social Communication Anxiety Treatment, is a formalized program that you can use. There's a lot of information online about it. It primarily consists of 4 different stages that you put a child through, progressing from stage 0, which is totally non-communicative, non-interactive, to stage 1, which is nonverbal, to stage 2, which we call transitional verbal, to stage 3, which is very verbal. And then the ritual sound approach is a part of the transitional stage where you teach sounds production from the mechanical perspective. So, oh, that, your name is Bobby, that starts with a B. Oh, I make that sound with my lips. I have to put my lips together to say but. It's kind of explaining sound production from a mechanical perspective. And then it progresses to using phonemes, using syllables, and then into words, which is kind of what we do anyway as a speech path. But this is like all fancied up and put in this really cute package. They have sometimes used an alphabet board for some kids, which those kids I think that are very visual, the alphabet board might be successful, so they cross off the letters as they've mastered them, but that also gives you an idea of what sounds they can actually produce. And then it also acts as a buffer between you and the child, in that they're looking at the board and not necessarily making eye contact with you, which could increase their anxiety, which could decrease their ability to comply. And then non-speech sounds are part of the program depending upon how the individual responds, and the SLP focuses on attention on the production of the sound words. So, oh, sorry, I could have skipped that up there. I should write this out. There's your little alphabet board, which kind of reminds you of facilitated communication. And then here's what it actually looks like when you go to the social, the SMART Center, where they recommend that you go through their psychologists who've been trained in the social communication bridge. But as speech paths, you are totally trained to work on this. So I don't want you to feel like you cannot work on it. This is just a fancy way of looking at it. I'm going to show you another approach here that's a little bit older, which is the social pragmatic approach, which has a lot of the same components as the SCAT. It begins with simple participation in social activities from a nonverbal engagement to a final goal of verbal, which is, they just don't call them stage 0, 1, 2, and 3. And it also works sometimes with small groups that can help advance to larger and then whole group setting. Because when I have a child that has pretty severe selective mutism, I'm always looking at making them be more integrated so that things appear more typical. And that's really hard when you're doing one-on-one in a room or one-on-one at home. So you have to be looking at how that generalizes out. And so from the nonverbal, you'd be gesturing, pointing, touching, shoulder shrugs, all those nonverbal cues that we work on with many children. And then to the verbal, I do start with a non-speech sound. And I do a lot of stuff with dollhouses in play where I'm self-talking during the dollhouse because it acts as a really nice buffer between us, and I can be self-talking and modeling, and the kids can be picking up on what I'm doing with the dollhouse. Advances to turn taking. Sometimes when I first start to the word, I'm going to look at the sounds and the words that I hear them say, and then I'm going to try to take that to a less intrusive interaction. So it might be something like, wow, look at this block, wonder what color this is. So I'm going to wonder, oh, I think this is blue. Oh, it's not blue? Yellow, that's right, it's yellow. That whole sabotage self-talk, and then I always consider my communication partners. If I have a classroom teacher, sometimes there is a relationship issue that may have happened with a classroom teacher where I've had a teacher that's kind of damaged the relationship between the child, so the child is pulled even more back in and they're not wanting to establish a rapport with that classroom teacher. So I talk about repair with the classroom teacher and how we can do that. Some classroom teachers are much more open and receptive to that than others. So then I maybe look at a specials teacher, music, will the child sing? And can that music teacher be helpful for me? PE, working outside and playing with soccer teams, that kind of stuff. And then I'm looking at familiar versus unfamiliar. And then the variable that pragmatic component, many times I'll get a child to a certain point and I think, okay, they're gonna generalize, and don't. And then I have to go back in and look at pragmatic function in managing conversation, multiple turns. If something happens and there was a breakdown in the communication interaction, how do I help them repair that? And sometimes when there's a breakdown, that's when I'll get them pulling all the way back in and then they're done. And I have to teach them how to repair. So I love my whole framework. That's tricky. That's kind of tricky. So I give them a way to say they don't know the answer or they don't know how to repair, and then we can help support them in that manner. When we're dealing with social communication disorders, there's a difficulty with verbal and nonverbal aspects of language for social purposes, the difficulties with social interaction and social cognition and pragmatics, and navigating social aspects. So if I have a child that has a social phobia, I'm going to look at that child differently with selective mutism than supposedly a child with autism. So we know that a child with autism automatically has pragmatic issues. That's a part of the diagnostic process. So I'm going to treat that child with autism differently than I'm going to treat a child with selective mutism. That's what I was trying to get at here. Okay. It can be distinct, a diagnosis, or it can co-occur with other issues. I find it troubling when it co-occurs with other issue, because then I'm like, what came first? Am I dealing with a child that's just low functioning and doesn't get it? Or am I dealing with a child that has a global developmental delay or learning disability? What is impacting the child's ability to speak? But the DSM-5 criteria is pretty adamant that it can co-occur, so I want to make sure you guys are aware of that. And again, this is an issue that I deal with at Children's Place all of the time. It was a conditioned response. So the children they would reach out to grab something, they get slapped. They reach out to grab something, they get slapped. Well, guess what they quit doing? They quit reaching out to grab something. So the same thing happens with talking. If they talk and something bad happens to them, they've been conditioned to not talk. And I have many children that when they first would come into Children's Place, I'd ask them a question and they'd cover their mouth. And so then, well, okay, that's not good, right? They cover their mouth here. So they've been conditioned to not talk because when they've talked, bad things have happened to them. And I treat them differently. And so do our classroom teachers there. So we put them in a honeymoon period where we allow them not to talk and we allow them to use nonverbal ways of communicating, and then we immediately require the verbal so that it doesn't become a pattern. Because I want them to know that when they talk, good things can happen to them. It's not always going to be bad. And so we do require the talking pretty quickly. So they'll get one serving of food, and if they want that second, they'll have to ask for it more verbally. And once we break that pattern, how many times do they have to use words and realize that not bad things are going to happen to them before their brain gets repatterned? And it is significant. It is significant. And I feel like it's going to be ongoing problems with these kids throughout their entire lives. They're going to get triggered by different things that are going to take them right back to that square one. So having that loving and nurturing home environment is so important. I have a sibling group now, or had, I retired. I had a sibling group now that there were 5 kids that had been systematically tortured over a period of 4 years. And they had burn marks in their groins and bruising, and they had bones healing in various stages of healing, so they'd been tortured over time. And there was a twin in the middle of them, a younger baby, and then a baby that was in utero when the abuse was happening, and then an older sibling. And they all came in not talking, all of them, and they all came in hiding their mouths. But they all came in, their home language was Spanish, and their foster parents were English only. So when I get the kid into Children's Place, what am I asking myself as a speech path? Well, is that because their language is Spanish, and so they've been traumatized and abused, and we're also Spanish. So I bring in my Spanish interpreter, who sits down and starts talking Spanish to the older boy, who crawls under the table and wets himself.
Oh.
So, comfort language not a good thing, right?
Yeah.
Because there's a trigger for him. So here I am back to the square one. How am I going to deal with this individual child? And it was tricky. It was constantly trying to try new things and put them in new situations and be patient and make them feel like that they could use language. But the thing that worries me is that he's going to transition out and go to kindergarten. And what's going to happen? Chances are we're going to be right back to square one. So who do I need to be talking to help that process? Those parents. And so we had numerous meetings with the parents. Now the twins that came in not talking and screaming for like a week actually ended up remediating pretty quickly. And we've been able to take them to play dates and to other preschools and daycares, and they're talking across settings and across different people. But then somebody new walked into the building who looked like the initial abuser, and we got a trigger that sent him back to square one. So again, this whole issue of trauma and what it does to the brain of a child when it comes to talking is horrible. And this family unit, when we discharged the older one to kindergarten just a few weeks ago, we told the parents this can be an issue, and those classroom teachers need to know that, and then how are you going to help them through that process. So treatment does vary, and there isn't a one treatment fits all kind of thing. There are layers. Okay? So the key, and I'm kind of proud of myself here. Pretty silly, I know, is collaboration. And sometimes we can get our little blinders on, and it's really hard for us to collaborate with other professionals. But I have found that when I take the time to walk into that other professional's office or classroom or home and take the time to team, I have a better outcome for the child. So I would strongly recommend that you take the time to do that with the daycare and with the grandparents and with all these, the church, whatever it could be, all these other areas that the child might be talking in. I do form smaller units of interaction. They do recommend helping to set up nonverbal initially, and augmentative can be PECs, can be signing. It doesn't have to be a machine. And I do reinforce the small successes. Sometimes the families are like, oh my gosh, this just isn't working. This is a long journey when you get one of these kids. They're not fixed in a few months, 6 months. I mean, this is a long journey. So trying to prepare the parent up front for that is hard too. I do ask the parents to avoid speaking for the child because I want the child to learn that they can speak for themselves. And that is a toughie because a lot of times as a parent, you automatically speak for your child because you know that this is hard for them and you want to protect them and help them forward. But letting them do that in a safer setting so that the child learns to speak for themselves, to advocate for themselves. And then keeping the lines of communication open for all, and then move those successes into other environments. Transition and generalization is something you cannot forget in this one. Usually as a speech path, we get a kid going in the clinic, we're good, it generalizes out. Well, not so much when you're dealing with selective mutism. Oh, sorry. Oh, look at this. Generalization, generalized spontaneous speech across settings and people. With my older children, I actually talk to them about generalization. I actually talk to them about, we want you to be able to talk wherever you go. And so let's look at what's hard for you. And so we create a level of difficulty and what's most difficult to least difficult. And I do this with my children that stutter as well. And I just want to prepare them for, we want you to talk in other situations and we're going to set that up for you. Because I want them cognitively and behaviorally to understand that when they do that, the good things happen. It's a good thing. And I reassure the individual with the process of carryover. Sometimes I jump the gun. I do it all the time. I don't do it sometimes. Because we know we can sometimes skip steps, right? And those steps can fill in for us. With this population, if you skip a step and you realize that it didn't work, then you might need to back it out, okay? And then you guys would just know, okay, I can't skip steps here. I'm going to have to change one aspect at a time. Maybe it's the location, maybe it's the individual, maybe it's a new person being present. At the school setting, I have this little boy, he goes around with the director and takes attendance. So he goes into different classrooms. So it's classrooms that he's seeing, people that he's seeing, children that he's seeing, but it's a whole different way of doing it. So I carefully plan that movement from structured to unstructured. And then ongoing assessment. If I see indication of anxiety or avoidance behaviors, I may need to break the task down, reanalyze the steps, helping the client be more successful with smaller settings and less demands. It's layers. Layers, that's right. That's the end. It's layers. And then there is a list of resources for you with selective mutism that, again, I will, print this out as a PDF and give it to Monica so you guys can have it.
Thank you, Kathy.
That's good.
Questions? Comments? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy.
It's so good to see you again.